Welcome to the Green Urbanist podcast, where we explore sustainable placemaking, climate action in cities, and urban rewilding. I'm your host, Ross O'Kelly, an urban designer, educator, and sustainable placemaking consultant. Hello and welcome to part 3 of this interview series on urban rewilding. My guests today are Ian Russell and Jamie Kukadia.
So hi everyone, my name is Ian Russell. I'm a principal engineer at the London Borough of Enfield. I've been working here for about 20 years, leading the council's watercourses team and working on a wide range of different projects focused on flood risk management and improving rivers.
Hi, I'm Jamie Kukadia and I'm a senior engineer in the watercourses team. I've been here 10 years now and I've been working on some really interesting projects as well with Ian.
This episode is all about a local authority adopting a rewilding approach to the way that they manage their watercourses and green spaces. In this case, it's the London Borough of Enfield, which is on the outer edge of North London. In the episode, we talk about their Rewilding Enfield projects. We talk about how they reintroduced beavers into London after, I think, a 400-year absence, and the benefits of bringing livestock onto land in a conservation grazing approach into urban parks and agricultural land on the periphery of the urban area in the greenbelt in order to boost biodiversity, to build resilience and to build flood resilience as well. They also give advice for others who want to take an urban rewilding approach in urban areas and explain why it's been so successful in Enfield. Lots and lots to be learned from this conversation, really inspiring and very practical in the sense that they sort of spell out all the many benefits of taking a rewilding approach and why it makes sense for them to do so. And I hope it inspires you to push for an approach like this in your local area as well. As I mentioned, this is part 3 of the Urban Rewilding podcast series. If you want to listen to parts 1 and 2, the links to those are in the episode description. You don't need to listen to them in order, so enjoy this episode and check those out afterwards. I want to start off by understanding what is your definition of urban rewilding that you guys use internally, I suppose.
So we don't have like a really good definition of urban rewilding. And I think it's fair to say we take a bit of a pragmatic approach to it because we recognise that kind of the purest kind of rewilding definition would be, you know, kind of like large scale projects where you're really letting nature kind of like take care of itself and you're reintroducing keystone species and so on. When you're looking at it within an urban context, you know, that's not always possible. We're still going to have a lot of, management interventions and so on to make sure that, the kind of projects we deliver are looked after properly and are successful in the long term. So I guess what we would say is it's more about, restoring nature and restoring natural processes as much as we can within that kind of limited urban context. If we go back a few years, when we started doing these projects, a lot of them were born out of sustainable drainage projects that we deliver because sustainable drainage is all about managing rainwater better. And it's about not just reducing the risk of flooding, but it's about reducing the impacts of urban diffuse pollution, on rivers and so on. And one of the key things about sustainable drainage is that it's about mimicking natural processes. People have realised that over hundreds of years, we've been trying to deal with rainwater by putting in more pipes and putting in drainage systems that get rid of water quickly. And what we've realised in more recent decades is actually that leads to a lot of, unforeseen problems and a lot of unintended consequences. So actually by restoring some natural processes, allowing rainwater to soak into the ground, restoring rivers, deculverting rivers, restoring wetlands that help to, soak up water, filter out pollutants. These are all things that help to improve the health of our rivers. And they're all things that we would categorise as rewilding in the sense that we're restoring those kind of natural systems and processes.
Fascinating. Yeah, I mean, it does sound very pragmatic in a sense. And I think it's interesting that, you're both come from an engineering background and a water engineering background rather than an ecology background. I wonder, Jamie, did you have anything you want to add on to that, or does that sort of sound good?
Yeah, I think that's quite accurate because we're working in really constrained urban environments. There's lots of different factors that are affecting our projects and that are affecting existing green spaces and blue and green spaces. So just trying to completely restore all those natural processes would be an incredible challenge. So it's also engaging with local people as well about our projects and what rewilding might mean to them, to that scale.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I'm definitely interested in hearing about how the public has been interacting with these projects as well. So maybe let's get into talking a bit about what your projects are. And if you could just sort of lay out for us, what have you been doing the last couple of years that you would tag under this sort of rewilding banner?
Yeah, so going back a bit longer to sort of, I think probably about 10 years or so ago, we started working with a London-based charity called Thames 21 on something called the Salmonsbrook Healthy River Challenge. And that was the first real project we did that really got us starting to think about how we could not only use nature and restore nature to kind of improve rivers, but also how we could really put, communities and local people at the heart of that project. So we were fortunate. We got some funding from DEFRA through something called a Catchment Restoration Fund, which enabled us to have a project officer who worked full time for 3 years. She was able to form some really good links with people in the community. And that was one of the first important things, was kind of, first of all, just asking people what they understood about their local rivers and their local environment, and where there were problems, and, talking about pollution incidents and flooding and, lack of biodiversity and lack of access to nature and things like that. And when you start to look at all those problems and you start to think about the solutions, and you're thinking, well, actually the solution in this case could be to try and restore this river or daylight this culvert or create some rain gardens here. What's great about all those kind of nature-based solutions is they have multiple benefits, so you're tackling the flooding by attenuating and storing and infiltrating water. You're tackling the pollution by using natural processes to break down and capture pollutants. But by doing that, you're also creating, wetland and river habitats that are valuable in their own right. So you're creating habitats for all sorts of wildlife. So that's, macroinvertebrates, dragonflies and things like that, but also small mammals and birds and so on. And as soon as you start to bring wildlife into a space, you start to activate it. And that's when people really get interested, because people can then, some people might love the fact that a river's cleaner just purely in its own right. They know that there's less pollution in the river. But if they know that lack of pollution means that there's more wildlife, that immediately makes it more interesting, more accessible, fascinating to people. And we've had a lot of success working with Thames 21, engaging with schools, but engaging with like Friends of Parks groups and, other sorts of organisations as well.
It's a different type of engineering, isn't it, Ian? Like, we call ourselves engineers, but really we're trying to work with nature, which is quite different to what traditional engineering would be. So where some engineers might try to tackle flood risk in a more hardscape fashion, channelizing rivers and watercourses, putting in tanks underground. Actually, the fact that we work for the council, we try and work and engage with local people. People have a better connection to wildlife and to their watercourse when they can see it, when they can interact with it daily. And that's probably one of the biggest drivers as well in how we deliver flood risk management projects.
Yeah, I love that idea that you're solving multiple problems, or you're creating multiple benefits from the intervention, and that's something I suppose the more hard engineering approach often missed around. These weren't places for people to be or for nature to be; they were just places that dealt with water in a very sort of mechanistic way. So, yeah, it's great to hear you sort of talking about the community and biodiversity and how it seems to be led in a very collaborative way. There's lots of different people involved. Is that the case?
Definitely. I think collaboration is really key to the success of all these projects, because we recognise that as a council, there's certain things that we can do really well, hopefully, like design schemes and hopefully manage spaces, to some extent. But actually, when we're talking about management, we want to get the communities involved in that as much as possible, because, local people are the people who use those spaces. They're there every day. Within the council, we don't necessarily have the resources to have people there every day looking after parks and rivers and wetlands and so on. So the projects that we've had that have been most successful are where we've had really, really active friends groups, forming kind of like almost like working parties, forming bonds with each other, getting out there, getting their waders and wellies on and helping to, look after these spaces better. It's not always possible to achieve that. As much as we can, we try and provide the kind of tools those groups need. And that's kind of literal tools like, spades and shovels and things like that. But also it's the kind of, abstract tools like training, and empowering them, to feel like they can actually, get involved in those spaces and become part of the solution to looking after their local environment. But I wanted to mention First Farm Wetlands in particular. That was a project we carried out in 2016, and it was the first really big wetlands that we'd done. So, but at this point, I think we'd done kind of 2 or 3 smaller kind of wetlands restoration schemes in the borough. A few 100 metres squared of wetlands that we'd created or something like that. Whereas First Farm was 4,000 metres squared, so much, much bigger scale. It was a kind of the total value of the project was over £1 million, which is still incredibly good value when you think about everything it's achieved. Involved creating this, huge flood storage area that could store almost 25,000 cubic metres of water and protects hundreds of people living downstream. So just purely as a flood risk management project, it does what it needs to do. But on top of that, it's created this, this wetland area that's used by hundreds of people every day. Children walk past it on their way to school. The friends group meet there several times a week. The friends group didn't even exist before the wetlands was created, so it's led to and supported the creation of the friends group. Recently, the friends got funding themselves for a community hub, which was built last year and opened this year. It's got a cafe. It's a space that local people can use and meet and socialise, and it's just led to so many other kind of like valuable outcomes that never would have happened without the wetland. If we could do that on every single one of our projects, that would be the absolute dream. Obviously, don't always have those opportunities, but it's just an example of what you can achieve when you create, a natural asset that people want to come and visit and spend time at and look after and, talk to their neighbours and their friends and, it has all sorts of amazing outcomes.
Yeah, that's awesome. And Jamie, did you want to jump in on that before I get into my next question?
Yeah, so we have delivered quite a variety of different projects in different urban contexts. So the wetlands programs are mainly focused in parks and parkland landscapes, whereas we've also been delivering quite a lot of what we call rain gardens. They're kind of little mini wetlands which you can install across the whole catchment. So they're really mainly focused in the highway realm. And that in itself has lots of different constraints and lots of different users and stakeholders. So you've got, vehicle users, you've got residents, you've got shops, you've got schools, you've got utility companies, and they're all kind of trying to get the space of the highway, the public realm. So how can we actually install blue and green spaces effectively in the highway realm that lends itself to a different type of collaboration. So we have to collaborate with all of these different users and also understand what the needs of the street are. They often turn into kind of traffic safety schemes, because what a lot of urban environments need is people to feel safer walking and cycling, and taking a shift from the more vehicle-centric way of getting around to more, safer ways of safer routes to get around without using any petrol or diesel. So, yeah, they that's a different type of collaboration, and we collaborate with lots of different teams within the council, and I think our highways teams and journeys and places teams have been really integral in helping us deliver those types of spaces.
I was going to add to that a few years ago, Enfield was chosen as one of the mini Holland boroughs. I think there were 3 across London that had quite a lot of funding made available to do lots of cycle schemes. And that was a kind of, I think £30-odd million spent over a relatively short period of time on putting in all these cycleways. But what that meant was a lot of opportunities to create rain gardens within the borough, within highway spaces. And that really kicked off Enfield's. I think Enfield's now got more rain gardens than any other London borough. And a lot of that is because of that, the legacy of that Mini Holland project. It meant that we could, put these features in lots of different contexts. And, in most cases, we were able to get really good feedback from the public that they value these new green spaces within their, within the streetscape. And that's basically given us the confidence to go and get more funding and deliver more of those types of projects. But also, as Jamie said, it's not just working with people like, Cycle Team and so on. We've also delivered a lot of successful schemes, even by working with people like Cadent Gas, who were, I think we got in touch with them originally because the Greater London Authority, the GLA, were looking for opportunities to coordinate street works across London to reduce the disruption we get from when people are doing, roadworks and so on. But by looking for opportunities to kind of combine them and coordinate them so that we could deliver more outcomes from one project. So they put us in touch with Cadent, and we kind of said to Cadent, we've got a list of projects where we'd like to do some rain gardens. And they had a program of work they were going to be doing in Enfield over the next 2 or 3 years. And we cross-referenced it, identified a location where we both wanted to do something. They brought that into their program. They did all of the usual kind of like digging holes and putting in new gas pipes and stuff that they would normally do. Normally at that point, they would put everything exactly back as they found it. But in this case, what they did was they left a hole ready for us to come and convert into a rain garden. And that was a benefit for them because it saved them money, but it was also a benefit to us because it saved us money. We were able to deliver rain gardens more cheaply than we normally would have been able to. So it's a genuinely mutually beneficial project. We haven't repeated it yet because we're still trying to find the best next opportunity, but it has led to, talk of, there's another project actually, I think, going on in a different borough. I think it's in Camden, similar sort of project with Thames Water and the GLA involved as well. And what we're looking to do over the next few years is to kind of roll out that concept on a much, much wider scale. And, hopefully we'll be seeing more urban greening and more rewilding as a result of that.
Yeah, I love that. It's such a great example of the opportunities that are so often missed in cities to actually make places wilder or greener, or bring more biodiversity in. So I think that's fantastic. But it really takes, I suppose, people like you being proactive and seeing the opportunities and saying, right, it might not be in our job description, but we're going to go and do these things because this is, how to get the best results. So that's great. I'm really interested to know, looking again at some of the larger scale stuff and some of the species reintroductions you've done. I know I've been to see your Enfield beavers. I think you're also doing something with livestock grazing. Is that right? So if you can tell me a bit about those projects as well.
So I'll talk a little bit about the beavers maybe, then Jamie, I'll leave you to talk about the grazing. Is that good?
Yeah, sounds good.
So I think, I suppose going back a few years when we were starting to do some of these large scale wetlands and river restoration projects in Enfield, and we've done probably about a dozen or so of those types of projects over the last 10 years. And we were using the tagline. We started using this tagline, Rewilding Enfield's urban water, because we recognised that was something that people understood. It was a good kind of catchy phrase that could have really resonated with people. But obviously, really, when you talk about rewilding, you're talking about species reintroductions, and people often refer to beavers as nature's water engineers. And we thought maybe there's a role for beavers to play in Enfield. But initially, I was quite sceptical. Initially, I kind of thought, well, really, is there anywhere in Enfield where we could have beavers? I'm not sure if that's going to be that easy. We went to visit a beaver site in Devon, probably about 5 or 6 years ago. And it was really when we saw that site, spoke to Devon Wildlife Trust, learned about how they'd done the project, learned about what the beavers had achieved in terms of creating wetlands and, attenuating water and so on and so on. We actually thought we've got to find somewhere we can do this in Enfield. Because when we create wetlands, we go in there with the diggers, we dig everything up, we make a big mess, and then we spend months trying to plant wetland plants and, let it all green up again and plant trees and so on. Beavers are basically doing the same sort of thing, but in a much more gentle, naturalistic kind of way. So we looked around Enfield for a site, and and we found one in Forty Hall Farm, which is run by Capel Manor College. And as soon as we mentioned this idea to them, they really jumped on board with it straight away. They were very keen, from the outset. So we then started progressing the project. We talked to people like Derek Gow and the Beaver Trust and Natural England. And within a short space of time, we were able to create an enclosure. The beavers have been living at that site now for almost 3 years. They've completely transformed it. They've built a lodge. They've built lots of dams. They've created lots of wetlands. It's been, they've achieved everything we really hoped they would. We're actually looking to expand that site in the next few months because it's been so successful. And those beavers, they've had 5 kits now since they were introduced. So the number of beavers is growing, and that will become a problem in the future. But we'll work with the Beavers Trust to find new homes for those other beavers, because I think there's around 30 odd beaver reintroductions that have been implemented across England over the last few years, and there's you keep hearing about more and more all the time. So that's been a really successful project. And actually, what we'd like to do next is find another site within Enfield where we could reintroduce beavers, and because the site we've got at the moment is fairly small on its own, it's not going to have a huge impact on restoring, natural river processes at a catchment scale, which is what we want to achieve. So, looking ahead to the long term, we want to have kind of more beavers, working across more of the landscape in harmony with the other natural flood management measures that we're looking to implement.
That's great. I spoke to Sean McCormack in Ealing a week or two ago. He was telling me about all his woes of going through the process of getting the license and all that kind of thing. I presume it was also quite a tricky process for you to get this project happening.
I think it took like 2 years or something. It's not a quick process. Maybe now it would be quicker. I don't know, because Natural England have probably done, they've done more and more of them, and they know, everyone understands the risks better. And I think when we did our one, we're not quite as urban as the project in Ealing, but it was the first one in London, and it's right on the edge of London. It's in a sort of peri-urban context. So they were, whereas I think a lot of the previous beaver reintroductions have been done, I don't want to say in the middle of nowhere, but in much more rural contexts. But I think, having beavers living in close proximity to cities is something that happens all across Europe and in places like, North America and so on. So it's not it doesn't present insurmountable challenges. And I think beavers, they're an important part of the landscape. They're a native species to Britain. They did live in Britain, obviously, until we killed them all. So it seems only fair that we give them a chance to thrive in their natural habitat.
Yeah, totally. I want to come on to Jamie to talk about the livestock, but I just want to follow up on one thing you said there first, which was about your sort of vision of restoring natural water processes. River. Can't remember the exact phrase you used, but something about natural riverine processes.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about how this sort of rewilding perspective fits in with that, and then are you working cross-boundary with neighbouring authorities?
Yes, I think, so like I say, when we first started looking at, restoring wetlands within urban parts of Enfield and rain gardens and rivers and so on, we were very much focused on the kind of urban problems. But we also realised that actually, if you're looking at a river, you've got to look at the whole catchment. And quite, Enfield's typical of many, many, catchments across the country. The urban settlements tend to be in the lower, often on the floodplain, in the lowlands, because people historically like to live near rivers, for all sorts of different reasons. And often what you've got in the uplands is kind of more rural areas, more hilly generally, But what we realised was that a lot of the flood risk in places like Edmonton, where there are thousands of properties at risk of flooding, a lot of the water that's causing that flooding is coming from the, further up the catchment. And in Enfield, we're quite fortunate in the sense that the Summers Brook, which is the main river that runs through the middle of Enfield, 97% of the catchment is actually within the Borough of Enfield. So we had an opportunity to work with ourselves primarily, but also working with the tenant farms, because although a lot of that rural land is owned by Enfield Council, it's leased out to a lot of different tenant farmers. So a few years ago, we started looking at opportunities to implement what we call natural flood management. So it's the same sort of processes as what we're doing in the urban parts of the borough, restoring rivers, reconnecting floodplains, recreating wetland habitats, and also planting trees and restoring other types of natural habitats, because they all what they're all doing is really slowing the flow of water, slowing it down, allowing infiltration to occur, filtering out the pollutants, cleaning the water and so on. And to do that really successfully, you've got to do it on a catchment scale. There's no good just doing it in a tiny part of the catchment and hoping everything will be okay. You've got to look at the whole catchment, look at where the problems are and where you can, achieve the most benefits by restoring these kinds of processes. So what we're currently doing at the moment is, for example, we're looking at restoring a 3.5 kilometre section of the Sandnesbrook River as it runs through the rural part of Enfield. And initially we'll probably have to do that by using mechanical, engineering techniques, because at the moment that river has been so kind of like engineered over the years. It's been straightened, it's been dredged, etc., etc. It's been deepened. It's now incredibly good at getting rid of water. It's so good at getting rid of water that every summer it goes dry because the surrounding soil can't hold the moisture. The water table's been lowered. It goes dry every summer. So not only have you got the flooding problem, you've also got the, this kind of like engineering that we humans have done to this catchment over the last kind of 150 years or so has led to worse drought conditions in the summer as well. So what we're looking to do is restore that river to a more natural state. That should help to make it more flood, resilient, but also more drought resilient, as well as creating loads of fantastic habitat for wildlife as well. What we would like to do is to actually reintroduce beavers to that location once we've done the initial intervention, because the beavers will help to kind of fine-tune the river restoration process and ensure that it's looked after properly for years to come. So that's where, we kind of see that there's an important role for us to play in that landscape restoration. But if we want to do it really successfully, you need to reintroduce the right types of animals to do the job properly.
Just a quick break to tell you about a free training and PDF download that you can access right now. It's called Urban Sustainability in 5 Case Studies. In it, I explain important sustainability principles through case studies of best practice, buildings, master plans, and public spaces. The link to the free training is in the episode description. That's great. That's so exciting and really fascinating. Over to you, Jamie. Anything to add on to that, or else tell me about the livestock grazing project?
Well, I was going to say a grazing license is much easier to obtain than a beaver license, but it still has its challenges. So where the livestock came from. So Enfield has got a vast amount of interesting parks and parkland landscapes. So we've got lots of historic parklands, and the way we seem to have managed them over the years has been kind of two extremes. We've either cut the grass on a very large scale to an inch of its life, which has led to kind of a lot of compaction, not much biodiversity. And that's also really bad for the river catchment. Runoff can come off the site quite quickly. And then to the other extreme, it's kind of completely unmanaged. And that can also be not as good for biodiversity either. So how can we manage our parkland landscapes differently for better biodiversity, but also for better flood management. And conservation grazing was something that was floating around. We were looking at in terms of the some more rural rewilding elements. We were getting inspiration from Net Wildlife Park, and we saw the interesting conservation grazing that was happening there, and we were completely inspired. But also we're completely inspired by our neighbours in Epping Forest, who've been doing conservation grazing for a number of years. I mean, they were doing it for many, many years before, but then they kind of reintroduced that over the last 5 to 10 years, in more urban contexts as well. So such as Wanstead Park, and We've also been in touch with Cam Cattle, who've been managing cattle in Cambridge. So we've kind of got these really great projects of inspiration of how we can use conservation grazing. And conservation grazing is when you're introducing, what I want to say is, rare breed species to manage the land, help us manage the land in a much more nature-friendly, environmentally friendly way. And it boils down to the stocking density, because if you've got a lot of livestock, that could go the other way. You could have a lot of compaction of the land. You could have complete overgrazing, and then you're in lawnmower territory. We were also talking to Natural England as well, and Historic England, about our parkland landscapes. So they're at heritage at risk, and it's also down to the way we've been managing those landscapes, which is why the heritage was at risk. So so they were very supportive of using conservation grazing within these large parkland areas. And now we've been working quite closely with our farmers. So we've been working with Cable Manor College, who manage 40 Hall Farm. We've been trialling out conservation grazing in small patches of Furze Farm and Trent Park. Not Furze Farm, 40 Hall and Trent Park. And it's been really successful. I think there was lots of apprehension with local residents about how the cattle might interact with dogs and with other people and with noises and, people playing football and people running within the park. But actually, we've proven that we can kind of coexist quite comfortably within the park, and there's always space for our new colleagues, which are cows.
I was just going to say, what's also enabled this project to happen is the new technology that's available, and it's nice because we're introducing a traditional approach to grassland management, which is grazing, but we're using new GPS technology, which actually involves putting a collar around each individual cow, which means you can track its location, but you can also control where it goes, because you can create an invisible fence, and it's like an electric fence, but it's better than an electric fence, because the cattle can be trained to understand when they're approaching it by responding to a noise. So basically, as they get near their virtual fence, they'll hear a melody or a high-pitched noise. And because they've already been trained on the farm to respond to this noise, they'll know that they're approaching the barrier. If they carry on approaching, they will get an electric shock like you would from an electric fence. But that doesn't happen very often. And what it means that this is a highly flexible management technique you can use. You can introduce it into a large park like Trent Park, which is around about 200 hectares. And you can introduce a relatively small number of animals, and you can basically put them in a certain part of the park, and local people can find out where they are by looking, by scanning a QR code or going on the website. They can see exactly, it's public information, they can see exactly where the animals are. And if they're going for a run or walking their dog and they don't want to go anywhere near the cattle, it's very easy for them to avoid them. If, on the other hand, they want to see the cattle because it's quite exciting and they might want to go and see them, again, they can go and see them. And this has all been enabled by, new smartphones and mobile technology.
That's great. I think the livestock aspect of rewilding I find so interesting, because I think livestock, particularly cows, have gotten such a bad reputation in the sustainability world for being a source of methane emissions. And we often think about sort of the meat industry as being sort of very polluting and carbon intensive industry, but when it comes to looking at natural systems, obviously large animals, herbivores, are on the land, should naturally be on the land. And I think, it's getting the right numbers, the right amount of disturbance in, so that they're having those beneficial knock-ons on the biodiversity that I think you guys are talking about. Is the idea with the livestock reintroduction projects or the conservation grazing, is it more of a biodiversity approach rather than a flood management intervention?
That is a very good question, because again it's something because me and Jamie are primarily interested in managing water better. That is our main role. But obviously, if we can deliver a scheme that has multiple benefits, then we're all for that, because that's going to help us to work with more partners. It's going to help us to attract more funding. It's going to get more community buy-in. It's just going to achieve more. Everyone's going to be happier if we can, deliver multiple benefits. And in the past, sometimes people have said to us, well, how come, you're the watercourses team, and how come you're doing this grazing project? That doesn't really make sense. But one of the reasons, I guess, for it are, we started off doing, sustainable drainage and wetlands. Then we started looking at natural flood management. And when we looked at natural flood management, and you look at, the catchments across Enfield, which are very similar to places like Knepp. You've got quite hilly, heavy clay soils. Historically, they weren't considered particularly suitable for arable farming. But in that kind of like post-World War II drive to increase food production across the UK, they were converted to arable. And to some extent, they've been successful. They produce a lot of cereal crops and so on. But that's only possible because of the kind of like intensive farming, lots of fertilizer, etc. The downside of that intensive farming is what we're seeing in terms of increased flood risk and increased pollution, increased erosion of topsoil, leading to more fertilizers and pesticides and so on being washed into our rivers, leading to more algal blooms and, problems in the rivers and so on. So when we look at the possible solutions and we look back at how that rural part of Enfield was managed 100 or so years ago, and you talk to some of the farmers, and it was historically, it was all pasture, basically. And we're thinking, well, hang on, if it was pasture, the river would be in a much better state. So maybe if we start talking to these farmers and talking about why they farm it in a certain way, maybe some of those farmers would be more interested in switching back to pastoral landscape. And we thought one of the good ways of achieving that would be to reintroduce grazing into some of our parks first. So that's what we've been focusing on. We are actually, some of we already work with some farms like Forty Hall Farm. Botany Bay Farm is another farm that's recently invested in a herd of longhorn cattle, which is the same breed that they use at Epping Forest and at the Knepp Estate. And we're hoping that slowly but surely that kind of approach will get more legs across Enfield as we go forward. And if we can achieve that, it means that, there'll be lower demand for, use of fertilizers and pesticide, but also it will enable us to do some of those other natural flood management interventions that we'd like to achieve, like the river restoration and, restoring wetlands and woodlands and so on, because they're more compatible with grazing than they are with other types of farming like arable farming.
These are quite a lot. These are quite a significant part of the catchment. So we were talking about how our primary focus is the catchment-based approach, how we can, restore river processes at the catchment scale. And these rural areas, these parkland areas, they are a huge, significant part of these catchments. So, and managing these properly in more environmentally friendly way makes a big difference to water capture, water quality, and also biodiversity.
That's great. That's great. I'm really interested, and I'm just mindful of the time that we're sort of past the 30-minute mark. I really would be interested to know, why do you think these projects have been so... there's been so much of this sort of rewilding type approach in Enfield compared to other London boroughs. So you're quite an outlier from that point of view. Why do you think that has been the case? What has kicked this off and what has sort of allowed it to be successful in that sense?
I think in Enfield, we're fortunate in the sense that, we have a lot of really great natural assets already in Enfield. Enfield is quite a green borough. We've got a lot of parks and open spaces. We have a lot of watercourses, over 100 kilometres of watercourses in Enfield, which is quite incredible. But a lot of boroughs just don't have those. Especially if you go to inner London, you might have the River Thames and the River Lee and so on. But a lot of the rivers, in central London have been really lost. They've been culverted and piped underground, and they're now part of a combined sewer system. There's no real scope to bring them back as natural rivers. So I think we were fortunate in Enfield that we had this opportunity to, fix a kind of like a broken natural asset, which were the rivers. And that we identified by working with partners like Thames 21 and people like Wildflower Wetlands Trust and the Rivers Trust and Cable Manor and so on. We identified these opportunities to improve our rivers and restore that natural landscape by implementing a range of different rewilding techniques. What that's meant is that we've been able to deliver some successful projects. That's been, they've been received really well by members of the community. That's fed back to councillors, and it's fed back to senior managers at Enfield Council who've understood those benefits, and they've embraced those projects, and they've encouraged us to do more of those projects because we've got a good track record now of delivering projects. That means that if we're applying for funding from people like the Mayor of London or the Environment Agency or other sources, we've got a good track record we can point to and say, look, we've done all these schemes already. If you give us some more money, you can be confident it's going to go well in the future. So that is helpful to us, that we've set these good precedents. So I think, to some extent, successful projects breed more successful projects. But I think, the fact is Enfield is a very large borough. It's got, like I say, a huge amount of existing rivers and lakes and ponds and wetlands and so on. So that's a great place to start from. But what we would love to do is to see other boroughs doing, similar types of projects. And we're always keen to, talk to colleagues. We talk to other colleagues in the Lee catchment and across other parts of London and try and, as much as possible, we try and share information and try and, demonstrate, where we've been successful. And I think people like Thames 21 are really a key part of that because they work across the whole of London and they can help join up, different boroughs, in terms of like taking a catchment-based approach. You mentioned earlier, Ross, about, the fact that sometimes catchments cross over political boundaries, which they often do. And I said that Enfield is fortunate in the sense that the main river in Enfield is almost entirely within Enfield. That's not the case in many other boroughs. Quite often it's the case that the flooding is occurring in one borough, but the solution is in a completely different borough. And that's where you need that joined up thinking to occur. And there are political changes happening. There's a London surface water strategy that's been developed over the last couple of years, led by the Mayor of London and other organisations like the Environment Agency and Thames Water and so on. And that's looking to create these catchment partnerships across London that will help boroughs and other organisations, work together better to deliver more of these types of projects.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I'm getting a sense of the sort of collaborative, just the amount of partners and collaborators that you mentioned as you're going through the projects, of just how many people are involved. What's been the reaction from the community or the support from the community like?
Overall, I'd say very positive. That doesn't mean that everyone unanimously agrees everything we suggest is a good idea. We sometimes do get some concerns raised by people. Some people don't, want things to change necessarily. From, they might look at their local park and say, well, I've lived here a long time and it's always been like this. Why do you want to change it? And, in those situations, we try and, we don't want to ride roughshod over people's opinions and, sensitivities and so on. So as much as possible, we do try and put a lot of emphasis on engaging with local people and explaining why we think something might be a good idea. And, generally, often we're trying to explain why the problem exists in the first place and why it's not possible to just rectify it. There's often not like an easy, straightforward solution, if you talk about flooding in Edmonton, why is there flooding in Edmonton? Well, arguably it's because people should never have built houses there in the first place because it was a marsh. It was a flood prone area, but the fact is, thousands and thousands of people do live there and that's not going to change. And that's why we need to kind of work across the catchment with all sorts of different people to try and, make it more robust and more climate resilient and so on. But yes, in terms of the sort of responses we get from the community, they do range widely. But a successful project for us is where we've engaged well with the community. If we can't convince local people that what we're doing is a good idea, then we've failed, really. If we believe in the projects that we're doing and we believe genuinely they're a good idea, we should be able to communicate that to people. And if we can't communicate it, either means that we're wrong in the first place or it means that we've done a bad job of communicating it.
It's often been that there's been a challenge in communicating our types of projects with kind of more of the urban areas, because they're not necessarily thinking that rewilding is a big priority for them. The people are worried about cost of living, they're worried about the NHS, they're worried about education. So it's not necessarily always in the forefront of people's minds that the benefits of rewilding. So certainly in the future, I think it would be amazing when people start to actually request these different interventions like rain gardens, wetlands, when they start requesting them, because we do deliver them and people do like them. They don't always tell us, hey, we love this project, but it's kind of it usually has a very personal impact on people. It's with their health and well-being. They might want to walk out and around their local high street more, or they might want to walk around in their local park more. And that's sort of data that we can't quite capture, but we know it is happening because, sometimes we talk to people out in the street when we're doing work and they're like, oh yeah, that's really nice. I like that. I walk around more often, or, I sit there and I read my book more often, or, I can hear the birds, or I can see the bees and see the butterflies. That's not always conveyed to the council. And, I don't think people think, let's talk to the council and say that we like this thing. But actually, I think it is becoming more and more prominent in the impact of urban green space, because we know that the impacts of climate change are going to affect the more urban areas more. So it's really important for us that people have access to rewilded areas, and there's less polarity between the more kind of richer areas and the poor areas in terms of a rewilded space.
That is great, thank you. We're getting into the home stretch here, and I don't want to take up too much of your afternoon. So I'm going to move on to the final question, which is a big one, but what I'm looking forward to getting your perspective on, which is about if we sort of zoom out from the projects a bit and look at we'll say urban rewilding as a wider movement. What would be your sort of definition of success for that? Where do you want to see that going in the coming years?
I think that's following from my previous point that it would be great if that's the forefront of how people think about other elements, because we talked about the multiple benefits of urban rewilding. We're talking about mental health and physical health and well-being. We're talking about, traffic safety. We're talking about lots of different, urban heat island effect and climate change and flood risk and water quality. There's so many multiple benefits of urban rewilding. So I think success would be that it's very normalised. Lots of urban rewilding projects are kind of flagship projects, ad hoc projects. If it's normalised and it's available to everyone, I think that's success.
I think when we think about that kind of wider opportunities for rewilding, what we recognise, and a lot of people, this is in the kind of public discourse, is that urban nature has been significantly depleted and undervalued. So we've seen, certainly in Enfield, we've seen a lot of people paving over their front gardens, for example, so they can park their cars there. Sometimes even in their rear gardens, they're not managed in a very nature-friendly way, although, there's a lot of positive conversations going on about how you can kind of like rewild your garden. Even if you've got a small garden, there's all sorts of positive things you can do to make it more friendly, for wildlife and so on. But as we said, there's a lot of examples of people kind of not valuing nature. And if you look at even the green spaces within cities, they're often quite relatively poor, in terms of what they provide for nature. You might have like a lot of verges on the side of the road, but often they're just very, very short grass that just gets cut frequently. So when we see movements like No Mow May, saying, wouldn't it be a bit better maybe if we just let the grass grow a little bit longer, and that'd be better for, bees and butterflies and so on. And it might look a little bit untidier to some people's perspective, but actually if you understand why it's better for nature, then maybe it doesn't look untidy. Maybe that's just, trying to kind of achieve that shift in terms of, how we view things. And like Jamie said, actually trying to kind of normalise having more better connected, better quality nature within cities. If we can achieve that for us, that's a huge success. That would be, if we can get people, people understand why we're doing it, and they look at a rain garden, and instead of saying, oh, what's that? Why have the council wasted money on that? If they say, oh, actually, I know what that is. I'm really glad they've done one of those on my street. I'd love to actually help look after it. That for us would be, the biggest success we could have, really.
I guess based on what you're saying, is it fair to say that there's a lot of potential for rewilding to become a lot more mainstream and spreading, across the country, different towns and cities around the UK?
It does, and to make our cities, more, climate resilient. It's almost like we really need to do it. I genuinely believe that. I mean, Jamie mentioned, the urban heat island effect. So that's just one aspect of the positive things that rewilding and urban greening can achieve. Because, we know when you get a heat wave, cities tend to be like 2 or 3 degrees hotter than the surrounding countryside areas because they're all, smothered in concrete and other hard surfaces and so on. So if we can have more trees, more green spaces, more evapotranspiration, that's going to achieve the outcome of cities being cooler during hot conditions. That's just one of, literally dozens of benefits that you could come up with alongside, reducing flooding, increasing biodiversity, creating more diverse, interesting spaces. One of the things we always try and do is integrate these features into the landscape so they become seamlessly part of the landscape. Like Jamie mentioned earlier, encouraging, active transport, like walking and cycling. That's what we're aiming for. So yeah, that's the vision. I think there's loads of fantastic examples around the country of really big successful projects. Like there's one in Sheffield that was done a few years ago called the Sheffield Greater Green Project, where they've put huge rain gardens right in the city centre, and it's been incredibly popular and successful. And I think that's the kind of like dynamic change that if we're going to have cities that are, just happier, healthier places to live with better air quality and, less kind of like heat stress and so on and so on, that's something we're going to need to see on a really wide scale across London and other cities in future years.
Excellent. I think, I said that would be my last question. I might just squeeze in one more question, which is just to finish off for other, we'll say, local authorities, people who want to be involved in doing similar work that you've been doing. What were some of the sort of big challenges that you found you needed to overcome? And in a sense, what would you advise other people to look out for to overcome those challenges?
From our point of view, collaboration with other organisations is the absolute key, because it's, there's, what's the old saying, a problem shared is a problem halved or solved or whatever, but it is genuinely like that. So for example, if we were looking at a particular street and thinking, we would like to put some rain gardens on the street because it would help to solve a flood problem. But then we work with our Journeys and Places team and they say, well, actually, we're looking at doing a school street there, or we're looking at doing, a cycle scheme or something else like that. If we can work together on it, we can share the costs. We can also share the benefits. And it just makes, that for us is, because the biggest obstacle that we have to any of these projects really is finding the money and finding the space. So if we can deliver a project in tandem with another partner or more than one partner, that means immediately it helps to solve the funding problem. But it also helps to solve the space problem because we are using the space for more than one purpose. So rather than just having, a rain garden that manages water, it's also part of the cycle scheme because it's creating, for example, it might be creating, a barrier between cyclists and cars. That's making the cycle scheme safer, slowing cars down, etc. That's making better use of space. It's a more effective project. It's a better outcome all round. So yeah, that's a really good way of approaching it from our point of view.
That's great. Thank you. Any final words from you, Jamie?
So I don't want to leave on the challenges. I think as Ian says, we're always happy to talk to other boroughs about how we've been able to deliver these rewilding projects on a wider scale. And what keeps on cropping up is the management. You know, people always say, "Oh my God, these new spaces, they need management." But every existing space needs management. So it's not always this is new management or additional management. It's a different way of managing it. So it's not necessarily additional costs. It might be changing the way we do things. So as Ian said, there might be verges that we're cutting very, very short, but you know, what if we left them to grow a little bit more in May and June, and you know, develop wildflowers? That's a cost saving, because we're not going there and cutting the verges. So there needs to be a shift of how we think we need to manage different spaces. So it's often a question, but it's not always a challenge if we think about it differently.
In the context that we're in terms of, you know, lack of funding, lack of people with the right knowledge and the right skill sets, these are lack of community understanding of what's causing those problems in the first place, or that is actually getting you to raising community awareness about flood risk, for example, is a big one, because things like walking to school or driving to school or, you know, having pollution, they might be things that you deal with on a day-to-day basis, but flooding is something that doesn't happen very often. But, you know, as we've seen in Spain recently, when it does happen, it can be catastrophic. And trying to communicate that to people without wanting to be, you know, without alarming people, trying to communicate it in a way that explains the risks and the possible solutions in a kind of proportionate way can be really hard work. But that's something we again try and put a lot of focus into where we can anyway.
Yeah, that's great. No, I think that's great advice and perspective, I suppose, for sharing. And I think a lot of other local authorities would probably echo that as well.
But that goes back to normalising everything again, Ross. Like if everything's normalised, then actually that management challenge or that perceived management challenge, it kind of goes away. And also there's a more understanding of why we do these things as well.